Hi, I'm Wendy Gardner and I'm the brand ambassador for the McCall Pattern Company, and I'm here today to show you how to create this wonderful Yves Saint Laurent Vogue original. We're going to use this pattern, which is a limited edition pattern. It is a replica of the original 1960s Yves Saint Laurent Paris original. And we're going to create the design from the tissues that are inside, which are actually based on this design here. So on the design you can see, these are the pattern pieces that are in the pack, and I'm going to then hack it or adapt it to create this lovely Yves Saint Laurent with the stripes. Now this is actually based on the Mondrian style, which is a designer or a painter from the 17th century, and he's very well known for his colour blocking. So first thing to do is to cut out the tissue that you need, but do remember to check your size, and the size is by taking measurements, not your high street size. So take bust, waist and hips and compare them to the measurements on the flap of the envelope. And you can see that there's different bust, waist and hips for each of the sizes here. And you may very well be a different bust and waist and indeed hip as I am. But that doesn't matter because there are multi-cutting lines. So each of these packs comes in 8 to 16 or 16 to 24. So you've got plenty of scope there to go from one size to the other. Get your tissues out and cut them out. Once you've cut them out to the size you need, we're going to trace them off onto separate tissue paper, which is why it's a good idea to get something like this Palmer Pletch paper. It is tissue paper like the original tissue paper. It's got a grid on it, and this grid is marked in imperial measurements, so it's in inches. So you've got half inches, inch, quarters, and eighths. So it's really good when you want them to transfer markings, get the straight of grain, etc. You can use the grid. So I've traced off my original pieces, which I'm going to set to one side because these will be used for the lining, because the lining will stay the same on the inside. What we're changing is the dress. And for the dress, we need to reduce the pattern pieces in order to make room for the stripes. So on the front piece, I've folded in 1.5 centimetres, which is 5/8 of an inch. So I folded that down the centre front. I've also attached the lower section because on the original design, you can see it's got a wide lower section. So I've attached that because we're only going to have a narrow band, and folded up 4 centimetres, 1.25 inches, so that I've got room to put the band without changing the length of the original dress. And on the top of the dress front, I've cut off 2 centimetres. So again, that's to make room for the band. On the back, I've done a similar thing, but this time, because the back is actually done as all one piece, I've actually lapped the yoke and the back piece. And don't forget, when you're lapping, you've got the 15 millimetres, 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, so you'll lap those across. It's a good idea to actually mark the seam allowance so that when you lap, you can have one over the other to make sure you've done that correctly. And I put the bottom section on again, lapping the seam allowances, and taken up the 4 centimetres, but only folded it up, not cut it off, because this back piece will not only be the dress pieces, it will also be the lining pieces. The front, we use the original pattern for lining and the new pattern for the front pieces. And of course the yoke. Now, if I show you the 2 yoke patterns, I've got 2 pieces, and if I place them together, you can see how I have made my new piece smaller. So again, I've folded in the centre fold, 1.5 centimetres, 5/8 of an inch, and cut off 2 centimetres. Now I've cut off the 2 centimetres here because it is slightly curved. And of course the new piece, you want it to be smaller to make room for the yoke. That is now ready, and I've drawn grain lines in because again, you're not cutting these pieces on the fold because you want the contrast. And as you can see from the dress I'm wearing, it's the same pattern, it's the same Yves Saint Laurent dress, but I don't really like to wear white, so I've made it in different colours. And that's the beauty of making your own clothes. You make them in colours that you like, in fabrics that you like to fit you. So my tissue is ready. I've transferred the markings, I've got grain lines in place. The next stage is to make the strips, the black strips. So all of these black strips need to be 7 centimetres wide, so that when you have the seam allowance on either side, they'll end up, the only bit visible will be 4 centimetres wide. The first strip, the yoke strip, 7 centimetres wide, and then it needs to be the length of the bottom edge of the yoke. And I can't give a measurement for that because it depends on the size you're making. So you just check it against that. You can use a tape measure to measure it and cut it, or you can cut a longer piece and then cut it short when you've checked it against it. So it's the same length as the bottom of the yoke. For the front strip, the pattern says to cut a strip, again, 7 centimetres wide, but 98 centimetres long. Now this will be longer probably than you need, but better to have a bit hanging off the end that you can cut off than suddenly find it's too short. So that's enough there for whatever size you're making. And then the bottom strip, again, is wider. Now this time it's 11 centimetres wide because it will be folded in half and attached to the bottom so that the end result is perfectly even, 4 centimetre wide strips, and around the bottom as well. So that's the pattern pieces hacked. Really simple, all straight lines, easy to fold or cut off. The next step, of course, is to cut out in fabric. But I did mention earlier that the lining is cut for the front, is cut from the main piece, the original piece. So all I've done for that is I have attached the bottom section and lapped them. Now, of course, I'm sort of going through this as if it's that easy, and it is, because in the pattern instructions, you will get your instruction sheets. They tell you what pattern pieces to use, it tells you how to do this hack, and it tells you how to lay this out on fabric. So if you look at the instruction sheet, it's all there, all nice and clear, with lovely step-by-step instructions. So the pattern pieces are ready to go on the fabric, which I have already cut out. So the next stage, having done that, of course, is to start sewing. I'm now ready to sew. Now I'm actually using a polyester crepe, which is a really lovely fabric to sew with, but it's very difficult to say which is the right and wrong side. So what I do when I use something like any fabric that you can't tell the right from the wrong side, I make sure I mark the wrong side with pins, double pin, single pin, or you could use a chalk mark. And that just makes sure when you're putting rights and lefts together, you don't end up with 2 lefts or 2 rights. First step to do whenever you're going to sew any garment with a curved neck edge, stay stitch the neck edge. This is particularly important on this dress because you are going to do lots of fiddling and seaming. So you want to make sure you don't stretch it out of shape whilst you're handling it. Stay stitch is very simply a straight stitch in the seam allowance, so just close to the seam line, the regular stitch length, just as it comes. And you just sew around the curved neckline. On this dress as well, I'm also, and have already done, the bottom of the yoke. Because we're going to seam it, and it is slightly shaped, as you saw earlier, I have stay stitched the bottom. I have also already neatened my raw edges. Now normally I would do this after I'd sewn the seam, but for the demonstration purposes I've done them separately. And I have pinned my yoke strip right sides together. I know that because my pins are on the other side. Right sides together and the bottom edge, and I'm going to sew that. Now it's really important that these seams are absolutely straight. You've got the markings on your throat plate. When you turn your sewing machine on, the automatic needle position will be 5/8 of an inch away from your 5/8 line. But it's still difficult to see, very hard to see a line on silver. So I've got a little gadget which I can put on. It's a little magnetic seam guide. I can line it up with my 5/8 line and use that as my edge. An alternative, very easy alternative, is a piece of masking tape. So again, lay it down so that the edge is on the 5/8 line and use that edge as your guide to do your 5/8 seams. So just start, and reverse, and then away I go. I can make sure I've got a nice straight edge because I am using that guide. And once I've done that, I will then attach the bottom edge to the dress section. But before I attach the bottom edge to the dress section, I want to neaten the top edge, because I've already neatened those other pieces. I'm going to neaten this one. But I wanted to do this with the over edge foot that usually comes with most sewing machines. And the reason I'm doing that rather than the overlocker as I did for the other pieces, because not everybody has an overlocker. So I want to show you how to use this really fantastic little foot. Now this foot comes with a metal guide down the centre, a little metal bar, and that holds the fabric edge flat. And it'll either have a narrow right toe or a thicker right toe, which you butt the edge of the fabric against. So the fabric will go along the edge as you sew with your over edge stitch. And the over edge stitch has got a straight stitch down the left with a zigzag going along the right. Most machines will have these. It's a standard basic stitch. So I'm doing this in black on the white so that you can see it. Put the fabric under, butting up the edge of the fabric to the inner edge of that right toe. I'm just going to go through the whole stitch sequence using the balance wheel on the side to make sure it works, doesn't hit the foot and doesn't hit the side of the throat plate. It's fine, and off I go. And what you get is a nice neatened raw edge. So you must neaten all of your raw edges, particularly any that are exposed, and that'll stop them fraying away. And as I did when I was about 18 years old, standing at a bus stop and realising my side seams have all come apart because I hadn't neatened my raw edges. Obviously, you would normally do this with a matching thread. So there's your nice neatened edge. So I'm now going to attach the yoke strip to the top of the dress. So that's my wrong side, as I know. So I'm going to turn that over and put the yoke strip so it's right sides together. And I'm going to always work with the yoke strip uppermost so that I can see that I stitch in a nice neat line. I'm also pinning vertically down the seam. Normally I would pin at right angles, but this fabric is quite delicate and it can snag if you use blunt needles, and potentially you can snag the fabric and get a nasty run. So to make sure, I just make sure I pin in the seam allowance only. So I'm dropping that foot off, putting the regular foot back on. And I'm going to revert back to straight stitch, put my guide back in place, and then I'm ready to go again. You see, I haven't started right at the beginning. I've started about 1 centimetre in, and then go back to the beginning and then go forward again. It's just quite a useful thing to do, particularly if you're working with very lightweight fabrics. This is actually fine, but if I was working with a fine silk, if you start at the very end, it can get pulled into the feed dogs. So it's a good idea to start about 1 centimetre in, go back, go forward, and of course you can hold on to the thread tails too. So now my yoke is attached, so that's that piece ready. Now what I want to do with that, having got it all ready, is I'm going to press those seam allowances in towards the yoke. Because if I press them the other way, they would show through, they would show as a lump. So they pressed in towards the yoke. I'm now ready to attach my long strip. So as I'm going to cheat a bit, you must press the seam before you go over it again, but I'm actually going to just pin it for this demonstration. So I'm just taking those pins out. I don't need them to show the wrong side anymore because of course I know. And again with right sides together, I'm just going to pin the strip in place. Now I'm going to start a little bit above the top edge. Again, that just gives me a little bit of room to manoeuvre if I need to neaten that top edge, I've got something to play with, because remember we cut an extra long strip. I'm then going to pin it all in place, and I'm going to be stitching from the bottom edge up to the top. Now I'm using plenty of pins because this is quite a bouncy fabric and it has a tendency to spring apart if it's not well pinned. Of course, if you prefer, you can tack the layers together by hand first. But I prefer to what's called pin-based, which is just doing the same thing but with lots of pins. So now the strip's going to be sewn on. Again, line it up with my guide. Start a little way in. You can see I've got this big tail. This was the extra I cut. So that's there if I needed the longer strip, but it will now be cut off at a later date. So just forwards, back just to anchor those stitches in, and then off we go. As I get to the top here, which is where my horizontal strip is, remember I said that the seam allowances for the strip have to be folded in. So I've got those pinned in place. I'm now going to hold them there and just go over these bits. Going a little bit slower because I've got all that seam allowance underneath there. And then just onto the end. That strip is now attached all the way down, ready to be pressed. And again, the seam allowance pressed towards the strip. And then I attach the other side. So I do the same thing with the other side with the white panel, because this is the only red panel. So that one will be going here. Cut my little thread tails off. And on this side, I'll have white, black, white. Don't forget, you must press those seam allowances. You can see how bouncy this fabric is. So now I'm just going to do the other side before I put the two sides together. Just going to finish this last bit of the yoke. So I've attached the yoke to the strip and the dress to the strip on the other side. That's the other one ready. So now I'm going to attach this right sides together to the long strip. And of course, the very, very important thing here is to make sure that those two horizontal pieces match perfectly. So I'm going to fold that strip in half so that I can check that and then just pin in place. I'm pinning that in place now. And then go to pin the top and the bottom. And if you remember, I said about having the seam allowances towards the strip. So I'm just pinning that in to make sure that stays in place. Do the same with the other one. Lost the strip though. I haven't done that. I'm going to double check again before I go any further. Make sure they're in line. Lovely. Just checking that those stripes are going to match. That's lovely. And then continue to pin all the way down the long edge again, just like before. Now this time I am going to sew with the dress, the white side uppermost, because I'm going to sew from the bottom to the top. So both of them will have been sewn from the bottom to the top. It's always a good idea to sew all of your seams in the same direction. It prevents the seams twisting. So to do that, I'm going to continue to use the black thread on the top. Now if I was doing this at home, I would put white thread on the top and have the black on the bobbin. But I want you to be able to see the stitching, so I'm going to use the black thread. Pinned and ready to sew. So there's my front, all ready. It needs to be pressed, of course. Let's cut off my little thread tail here. If I pull it up and snip it, any loose end will go to the inside. So it's all ready to be pressed. And then the next step is to attach the backs to the front. I've got to do a dart. Let me just show you how to do a dart really quickly and easily and neaten that end, the pointy end of the dart, without getting a bubble. For this, I am going to change my threads, because once the darts are stitched, it is ready to put the backs to the fronts and continue following the pattern instructions to complete your dress. But this is the bit that's the hack, and this is the bit that's different to the original. So I have pinned the dart together, so the dart is pinned with the right side of fabrics together, following the markings that were on the pattern, which I'd transferred to the fabric. Now you can actually draw a line, or you can baste it with tack-in stitches. I'm just going to go straight into sewing it, starting at the wide edge, which is the side seam edge. Just back stitch to lock those in, and then off I go. And as I get to the pointy end, taper it right to nothing, I'm going to go a bit slower, pulling out that last pin as I go to get it out of the way, and then the last few stitches I want to be right on the very, very, very edge of the fabric. So I'm going very slowly. Then I go off for about an inch. Raise the needle, take that loop back and just stitch just inside the fold. Just go backwards and forwards a couple of stitches just to anchor the thread ends. And that's it. So I can just cut my thread ends off. Leave the little loop that's there, that's fine, that won't show. But that's a really quick, easy way of doing a dart without having to tie the ends off, because you should never backstitch. If you backstitch, you can get that bubble at the end. So that dart is now ready to be pressed over a ham for shape in it, and that will give the shape that's needed to go over the contours of the body. So you just need to add the back, add the lining, following the pattern instructions that are in the envelope. I hope you're inspired to have a go at making your very own Mondrian dress from this limited edition pattern based on the Yves Saint Laurent original. Enjoy!